Hello and welcome back. Hope you're having a good day. Today we're going to be going over making the interior for my 120-gallon PVC vivarium for my blue tongue skink. I kind of talked about it last video, the construction of the one for my corn snake. At the end I referenced making one for my blue tongue skink, so that's what we're doing today. Now, before we get into it, unlike last time, I'm not going to have a whole video dedicated to just making the PVC vivarium because that would be repetitive for you and me, so I'd much rather avoid that. And to get around that in the future, my plan is hopefully in the next video, I'm going to make a video just making the PVC vivarium, kind of going through my entire process so you guys can follow along, and something I can kind of always point back to and reference. Because the only thing I'd have to change video to video at that point was how I make the background and put it onto the PVC vivarium, but that's not the most important. I just wanted to get that out of the way because I was kind of debating back and forth on making a whole other video making the vivarium itself, but we won't worry about that. I did kind of miss out on the background for this one, but it's the exact same process as the background for the corn snakes vivarium, so you can just follow the part one of that completely and end up with a very similar product. Anyway, moving on to the actual important meat of this video. So I'm going to be making this PVC vivarium for this gluttonous little sausage here. This is Reverend. Her full name is actually Reverend Evanescence. There's a couple of reasons into that, but the reason I'm making this enclosure is because she currently lives in the first enclosure I ever built. I built it out of plywood with some rubber sealant, and it came out all right, but not to my standards. As I learned more about this, I eventually developed different tastes in how I want to construct. So I'm just going to be making her a whole other 120-gallon vivarium here. I'd love to go bigger, but same as with the corn snake, I'm going to be moving in a couple of years. I know I'm going to be moving in a couple of years, and I'd much rather avoid the hassle. So I'll make them a nicer enclosure once we move. Now, the first thing we're going to be getting into with this enclosure is getting it downstairs. That sounds simple, but it is a giant box that's very expensive, and it was not fun doing it by myself, let me tell you that. I'd just recommend having a second pair of hands to help move it so you don't accidentally damage anything or hurt yourself in the process. Now, once that's nice and in place, we can actually go ahead and move on to the next step. In this case, it's going to be the bottommost layer, the drainage layer, which just for this one I'm going to be using Leca, but first and foremost we have an issue to address, and that is the bottom is absolutely filthy for making the background. Just a lot of loose material fell, so before anything else, I just take a paper towel and give it a nice dry rub, making a little dirt pile that I can vacuum out. Now, this isn't really a necessity because honestly this little amount of dirt won't cause any issues with the Leca layer, but I know it's going to be there, so it's going to bother me to no end, so I just went ahead and did it anyway. Vacuum asphyxiation aside, we're going to keep on going here. So onto the Leca itself, I would recommend hydrating before you actually put it in your enclosures. This does two things. One, it makes it a little less dusty, so it doesn't get dust everywhere, and two, it actually kind of kickstarts the drainage layer. It keeps the soil nice and wet whenever it's sitting on top of wet Leca because it allows it to drain straight through. From this point, we'd usually move on to the substrate barrier just to put something between the Leca and the substrate. However, I learned from past mistakes, and by past mistakes, I mean this right here. Now, if you don't know what you're looking at, this is my corn snake deciding to go kamikaze straight underneath the substrate barrier, head first. It was a whole mess. But this time things had to change a little bit, and I had just the idea. This time I'm going to be using these interlocking rubber drain tiles just to add some extra rigidity to the actual cloth itself. They just press together really easy like, and they hold their shape really well. You could go with something a little bit more solid, but I'm just going with these rubber tiles here. Even though each of these tiles is marketed as less than a foot, I still actually did have to cut a little bit of some of the length off. Right here I'm just cutting off some of the nubs on the end once I get it all nice and form-fitted. After dry fitting the tiles in the enclosure itself, I actually cut out a piece of fabric from weed barrier. In this case, I cut it a little bit longer lengthwise and a little bit longer on the side so that it wraps around the tiles whenever I'm completing it. Now you can use any form of weed barrier as long as it allows water to get through, because if it doesn't allow water to get through, then what's the point of a barrier? But all I do here is just set the tiles up on that fabric, and I go ahead and cut zip ties sharply with that wire cutter I was using before and poke it through the fabric, looping it around and tying it onto itself. It's really easy once you get the hang of it. Once you get those pieces cut and wrapped and tightened, you can actually cut off the rest of the nub so that it fits nice and flush with the rest of the fabric. Once the barrier's done, we can actually go ahead and get it over top that leca. Now, with the grace of a chimpanzee, you can see as I put the barrier in, and while it is a little bit more flexible than I'd like, it does provide a rigid barrier, making it much more difficult for larger reptiles to actually slink by the edges. They can't push it out because dirt's going to be holding it down, but as you can see here, this will act as a perfect barrier between the substrate and our drainage layer. Now, once we get this in, we can actually move on to said substrate and getting it put in. Now, before we actually begin on the substrate, I'm going to be putting in these 3D printed stick holders. They essentially help hold sticks vertically to create kind of the illusion of young or thin trees that you'd see on a forest floor. Not on a walking path per se, but the reason why I wanted to do specifically thin trees is because I like doing a lot of research on where you can find these reptiles in the wild and getting a bunch of nature shots. And I just so happened to stumble across an image from Papua New Guinea going over, I think it was paradise birds, and in that image I saw a lot of young trees on like a bare forest floor, and I fell in love with that image, so I kind of based it off of that. Now onto the substrate itself, I use something I like to call, huge air quotes around this, universal mix. The reason I call it universal is because it's just kind of an all-round good, decent mix, but you can throw in extra additives to make it more appropriate on a per reptile basis. So for like my ball python and my corn snake, I didn't really modify it as there wasn't a necessary need to. However, for like, let's say a more arid species, you could mix it like with 40% sand, 60% the substrate, and you get a nice arid substrate mixed in with it. So this time I'm going to be mixing an excavator clay as I go along, because Reverend loves to dig. She makes it a problem. She's going to destroy this enclosure whenever she's done. So to hold tunnels, I put in a little bit of excavator clay as I go along. I think I put in a total of like 3 or 4 gallons as I went along, but I'm going to throw up the percentages on screen now as I go along. But the substrate consists of topsoil, cocoa coir, chunked sphagnum moss, worm castings, horticultural charcoal, and reptibark, or if you have it available, orchid bark. The reason I like using this mix is it's really nutritious soil, it maintains humidity really well, but also it has some drainage in it, so it doesn't actually compact or get swampy all that bad unless I pour water, which I usually don't, I just end up misting. Once the soil is good and mixed up, I added some extra bioactive boosters, just helpful germs to get it going. But I don't forget the pots that are on the back wall as well. I'm just going to be using these pots for vining plants for this time. I'd usually like to put plants down in the dirt, but Reverend, as I said, is a bulldozer, so it would just not be worth it in the long run. But all I do is just take some of the topsoil I have on hand, not the stuff I use in the base, just because I don't need excavator clay, and I just fill up the pots as I go along. With all the substrate out of the way, we can actually finally begin on the flora. Now, this time, because it's a very temperate enclosure, I'm going to be putting in some moss on the walls. Now, I've never worked with moss. I had to order this stuff from Herbiculture just because I live nowhere near moss. So, I don't know anything about it or keeping it alive. I'm sorry if you guys are just pointing and laughing because I'm doing something wrong. This is completely new to me. Anyway, I just take some moss that I had on hand and just pin it up to the back through the foam, usually taking some floral wire I had lying around, but I also 3D printed some plant pins I actually used to help keep it pushed in. So once we get those pressed all around in like key locations of the enclosure, we can actually move on to the plants themselves. Now, I'm not going to be using too many, like I said, just because I'd much rather keep them alive. So I'm going to be mainly just sticking to vine plants in the background, and hopefully we won't be having any issues with her climbing all over them since they're going to be up in the background. Now, to start off with, I'm going to be taking some Rasta lipstick and a little bit of golden pothos and putting them up on the right side of the enclosure, up in that flower pot that's hidden behind the cork. I really like the look of the Rasta lipstick, and I'm hoping it doesn't get demolished, so I'm putting it up somewhere extra high. Now, I love the name of this next one. This is called Philodendron White Wizard. That is such an awesome name for this plant. I don't know how it's a wizard, but hey, who am I to judge? Anyway, I just put it in towards the back left corner. I'm a little scared because this one's the lowest to the ground, so it may have some issues, but it looks really good pressed up against the corner. It's also helping hide that wire cap you can see in the back there. And in the middle of the enclosure, I'm going to be putting some Philodendron Neon as well as some more Golden Pothos. I know Golden Pothos is kind of a cheap out, but I have so much of it. Also, I just really like the way it vines. But in this case, I'm putting down the gold first and then the Philodendron Neon next, just having them climb against the back wall. After all the plants are in place, I actually start on putting some air plants in just to fill in a little bit more of that backdrop between the moss and the plants. I didn't have too many on hand, so I just put the rest of what I had, but I just put them around locations using gel Gorilla Super Glue, and they stuck really well. After they'd finished curing, I went ahead and just gave the entire enclosure a nice mist to help with rooting. Some of the plants you see kind of towards the substrate don't last long, so do not plan on seeing them later. But I give everything a nice mist down just to get some hydration going on in the enclosure. Once everything dries, we can actually go ahead and move on to the hardscape itself. Now, to start off with, I'm just going to be taking this chunk of cork here and just sliding it into the dirt. It's going to be directly underneath the basking bulb, which you can actually see going off. I'm using it to help center down the aim. Now, before we go on to the right side, I actually made a hide for it, so I'm going to show you how I made that hide real quick. Now, for this hide, I actually 3D printed my own 12-inch large hide with PETG, so it is food safe, but I'm still going to clean it up anyway. First, we got to get all the dust off before we can actually move on to getting the interior nice and siliconed. Make sure you got some gloves for the next part, but all I do here is just take some General Electric Type 1 silicone, make sure it has no mold inhibitors or anything like that because they can be toxic, but I just slather it all nicely on the inside and a little bit on the outside. The reason I do it like this is because I'm going to be drenching it in sphagnum moss. I want the inside to be a little bit more sealed, but also have a nice texture, and also to hide the outside from you being able to see the black PETG, I'm just covering the front entrance with a little bit of that sphagnum too, so it blends in a little bit more with the enclosure once it's done. All there really is left to do is to get it into the sphagnum peat itself to get the silicone covered. I have this large tub of it because I use it for backgrounds for my enclosures, so I just start slathering the silicone in the sphagnum peat, and I just dip it in and leave it in to sit overnight. After a good night of curing, I shake it off in the morning, get off all the excess and let it dust for a minute, and that should leave you with a nice interior with a little bit of stuff on the outside to keep it nice and hidden. It has a nice texture and also just generally blends in with the enclosures much nicer than I thought, but let's go ahead and get this in the enclosure itself. Now, unfortunately for me, I didn't take this into account, so some of the sticks got in the way, so I had to move them while they were under the dirt, which it's easy enough, but it's still just kind of annoying how I had to move it out of the way. But once that's moved, I just move all the substrate out of the way and place that into the ground itself and just dig out a little tunnel by hand. After playing around with its rotation a little bit more, I went ahead and just filled the inside with dirt and just put more dirt over top of it to make sure it was flush with the rest of the enclosure. I personally think it came out looking really good because, yeah, you can see it if you're looking for it, but I think it looks really good with the rest of the enclosure because it creates more ample area for her to walk across and also bury in. Now on to some of the more miscellaneous hardscape and sticks and stuff. I played around with this as much as I could, but I couldn't come up with something I was comfortable with. I was trying to hit a balance of nice decorum with the sticks versus usable substrate room for her, because I know she's going to be digging it around anyway, so I didn't want to put too many sticks and just cause clutter. But I may come and revisit this in the future. As you can see here, I was just playing around with a bunch of different ideas, but nothing really stuck. It's perfectly okay for whenever you're working on an enclosure for not to have something that sticks. Some things do, some things don't. In this case, some of the layouts with the sticks just did not work for me, so never be nervous to try something, and if you don't like it, it's no harm, no foul. Once I got comfortable with the layout, I went ahead and just cleaned the background a little bit, and then moved on to the next part, which was putting in some sphagnum moss just around the enclosure. This will act as a hide for the cleanup crew, while also being hydrated so that the crew doesn't ever dehydrate. They basically have a nice, safe, humid haven that they can stay in. I put one in the back middle and then one in the front right, and just gave them a nice mist right after I put them in. There's only a few things left now for the hardscape, the first being the leaves. I just went ahead and took some dried, clean leaves I had on hand and just put them around. I don't expect them to stick around for long because they're going to be quickly buried in the dirt, but this will act as food for the isopods and springtails once they're put in, and also give a little bit of enrichment to Reverend whenever she's exploring her enclosure. Moving on to the other side here, I'm actually just going to go ahead and move her water bowl in now. I'm just using a Reptile water bowl. I'd have much rather made her one myself, but this one works perfectly fine. It's a little bit of an eyesore, so maybe in the future I'll start to make my own water bowls, but for now this one will work just fine. But I go ahead and put in the rest of the leaves just to fill out the bottom before I introduce the isopods themselves, so they have something to explore whenever they get put in. Speaking of the cleanup crew, let's go ahead and get to them. First, I'm going to be putting in some tropical springtails. I've been breeding this colony for a little bit now. It's just on some calcium clay, so I wanted to see how it came out, and I thought the colony looked good. I just filled it off with some distilled water and just poured them in over some of that sphagnum that's been in the bottom. Reason I do that is it just gives them somewhere nice and humid immediately, and they can explore from there. Now for the springtails, these guys get a little bit less of a honorable way of entering. I just tap off one of the cork chunks I have in one of their tubs and just sprinkle them in throughout the enclosure. As you can see, they just kind of pour in. These guys should hopefully breed and proliferate pretty quickly, just before I can get them introduced, since I have to let the enclosure sit for a little bit before I get her in. Now all that's left is to give the enclosure a couple of weeks. Since it's mostly done, we just gotta let the plants and the isopods take root. But while I wait, I'm actually going to finish up the top of the enclosure. Now, all I'm going to be doing for this is taking off the heat lamp and the LED, and I'm going to be test fitting a 2x4 foot silicone mat. It should perfectly fit on top, but it really never hurts to, make sure it's up to size. I'm going to be cutting holes into the silicone mat so the equipment can sit on top of the enclosure nice and flush. Now, the reason I'm using this silicone mat is I am in a constant battle with heat and humidity because I live in a desert. So, I know I could have gone with a closed top, but the reason I prefer mesh is because it's easier to store equipment on the outside of the enclosure going in. Also, airflow is way easier to control whenever an enclosure is a mesh top. Once you get the holes cut out, you can put the silicone back on top of the enclosure. I didn't include it, but I did cut out 2 extra holes, and the reason being is I'm going to be putting on a dual fan system on the enclosure. One of them is going to be blowing air in, and the other is going to be blowing air out. Now, the reason I do this is because I have them on a humidity-sensitive gauge, And so essentially, if humidity ever gets over, let's say, 80%, the fans will constantly try to fight humidity and keep humidity below a certain threshold. But it does two things at the same time. It also forces airflow exchange, so I don't have to worry about it in the enclosure. With everything done, we can go ahead and let the enclosure sit for a couple weeks, just so that we can get her moved in. Alright, now that everything is done and a couple weeks have passed, we're actually able to get her moved into the enclosure itself. Now, this was a lot more of a simple process than last time, since she has no way of accessing under the Leica, so she went in immediately and just decided to bum rush the hide on the right, which I was both happy and a little disappointed she didn't explore, but this is pretty stressful for her, so I can't blame her. After a little bit, I actually did decide to throw in a little bit of food for her, just so she'd get a little bit more comfortable. So it took her a little bit, but she did eventually come out and start slamming it down. Her apprehension did not last long, however, because the next day she decided to explore a little bit, and the first thing she found was her water bowl. Although, I think I discovered quickly after she took the phrase new room, new me quite literally, because after a little bit of time I noticed she began to shed, which she hasn't shed in a while, and she didn't start to shed until quite literally just being placed in this enclosure, so I guess she just wanted to get into a new change of clothes. She spent the first little bit just trying to get most of that shed off, so I have some footage of her just going around. You'll see some shed. For the later ones, she'll have it mostly off, but here you are. She explored for the good part of the day. She eventually decided to go somewhere where she shouldn't, and that led to this. It has been less than a day, and she's already causing problems. She shouldn't be climbing up there. That's not a skink spot. That was a spot I put nice plants to vine so that this would be avoided. But guess who's up there? You fat little sausage. I swear to God, if you trample those plants, I will ship you to a cannery. She eventually decided to climb down after being dramatic, but when she did eventually come down, she settled down for the day and just decided to bask for the latter half. I've never seen her bask like this before. She usually had a basking rock in her previous enclosure, but I think using a halogen bulb this time, as well as the cork, she really just likes sitting underneath that basking spot. That was until eventually the mister came on and she was not happy. With all that, though, I think that'll do it for today. This video went on way longer than expecting. I was expecting like a maybe 15-20 minute video, but apparently I like to hear my own voice because I talked a lot more than I should have, but I appreciate anyone who made it this far, and thank you for watching. I hope y'all have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you next time.